Hi, my name is Professor Gregory Love, and I teach Christian systematic theology here at San Francisco Theological Seminary in San Anselmo, California. And you're joining us in the midst of a 6-part series on the relationship between God and the COVID-19 virus and human suffering. Now, today we are looking at the last of the 4 models, which I strangely number as number 3. Let me explain. In the previous session, we moved from the first 2 models to the 4th model. And that 4th model imagined God as a lover and the world as God's beloved, or God as an artist and the world as God's beloved art. God lures the world towards beauty and love, and God battles those forces which are aligned against God's goals. And thus God battles this pandemic. Now we return from the 4th model back to the 3rd model, which we'll look at today. Of the 4 models, this 3rd model is the most complex. The complexity is both a strength and a weakness to this model. We come to it last because it sits between models 1 and 2 with their emphasis on divine control and on everything being part of God's plan, and model number 4, in which something chaotic and destructive has emerged in the world, and God is battling to preserve God's goals. This 3rd model borrows from all these other 3 models. The model has several unique aspects, including how it even approaches the question of God and human suffering. First, this model is Trinitarian. The authors of the other models may or may not believe in the Trinity, but they do not use it to understand God's relationship to suffering. Rather, they rely on God the Father, or God the Creator, as the one who rules and thus relates to the suffering. This 3rd model, however, understands the one God as a community of love, a love that is shared between the 3 persons of the Trinity. All 3, God the Father, Mother, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, are involved in ruling this world and thus relate to the suffering. Second, this model is centered on Jesus. Not only is it Trinitarian, it's Christological. Again, the other 3 models focus on God the Father, not on God the Son. But this 3rd model believes that God the Son, Jesus of Nazareth, is the key to understanding who God is and how God acts in this world and how God responds to our sufferings. Jesus is the lens through which we see. Jesus is the face of God. Third, this model is rooted in the biblical narrative. Now, God is all-powerful and all good. Those premises are correct. But this 3rd model believes that beginning with a philosophical premise will not help us understand how God is related to suffering, including the pandemic. Rather, the answer is in a story, the biblical story, about how this world came to be, how it became lost, and what God has done to find it. How the world became broken and what God has done to make it whole. That story is going to help us understand God's relationship to this pandemic. Finally, this model holds 2 streams together in one model. Now, the first 2 models convey the classic stream of God's sovereignty over all things. The 4th model conveys God's resistance to suffering that is endured by God's creatures. This 3rd model holds both of those 2 streams together. And that's part of what makes it complex. The holding together of the 2 streams can be seen in an image that it uses and in a principle. In other words, its theological norm. Now, the image is taken from the book of Revelation, chapter 5, verse 12. Quote, "The one who rules over all things is the Lamb who is slain." End quote. So the one who rules, that's the theme from models 1 and 2, is the Lamb who was slain. That's from Model 4. Notice how it includes both the ruling of Christ and the suffering of Christ. Now, the principle is stated by Dan Migliore about who God is. Migliore says, God is self-giving, suffering, victorious love. So, God is love, and that love comes in a Trinitarian fashion. The self-giving of the Mother Father, the suffering of the incarnate Son, and the overcoming of all evil by God the Spirit. Notice again how that pulls together these two themes, these streams from Models 1 and 2 and Model 4. Now, if this model is rooted in a biblical story, then it follows the arc of the story. And sure enough, when this model comes to understand something like a pandemic, it moves through three different movements, which you know anything about literary theory or drama, it's like having acts 1, 2, and 3 in a play. So let's take a look at what those three acts are in the drama. And they're these: God the Creator, the story of the fall of humanity into sin, and the actions of God to redeem a lost world from its brokenness. So let's start with the first one, God the Creator. And this model pulls that piece of Migliore's definition of God that is God's self-giving, like a mother or a father would give to her or his infant child, son, daughter. Okay, so beginning with the doctrine of creation, God's goal in creating us is a mutual relationship of freely given love. God wants a genuine partnership. Now you can see how this model, number 3, borrows the divine goal found in the second model, the soul-making model. God is a God of love and wants to create love. But that goal of love demands something. Even if God is all-powerful, it still demands something. And what is that? That God give to the humans, the partners, freedom of the will. God must give creatures time and space and their own power to choose and to act. Otherwise, there's no love. Now, however, for God to get that goal of human free will, God has to give something else to this world. A relatively autonomous natural world. One that runs on its own principles. Because only such a world can provide a stable environment for humans to act with freedom. Now notice that already, with that part of the narrative about creation, the all-good God has let some forms of suffering into the all-good world. For example, this is a physical world. That's part of the all-good creation of the all-good God. The physicality means that we can enjoy the beauties and wonders of this world. We can climb mountains, we can hike through wilderness, we can play soccer. All these things are challenges that, in fact, are life-giving. Also, borrowing from that second soul-making model, this third model provides moral forks in the road. Will we be generous and love others, or will we be selfish and hate others when this world presents us with challenges, like a pandemic? Furthermore, already we're only on the doctrine of creation, but what we see is accidents can happen. In other words, if we fall down in a physical world, we can break our arm. And if we get bit by a mosquito in Fiji, and we haven't been taking our quinine, we can get malaria. The presence of viruses in this world is part of that good creation, that physical world. These are the risks that make many good experiences possible. And God took those risks in creating the all-good world. Okay, so that's Act 1. God the Creator. All good, all powerful, making an all good world. But now we move to the second act. The second act moves from the good creation to the fall of this world into brokenness and disharmony caused by the misuse of free will by the human beings. And where it gets us in the biblical story is it focuses in the Old Testament on the Exodus account and in the New Testament on Jesus. And what it sees is not only the self-giving of this God, but the suffering of this God. So, what does this mean? Unlike model number 2, this third model does not say that all sufferings lead to growth. Some sufferings lead to growth, but not all sufferings. It doesn't say everything's going according to plan. No. Humans have free will. God took a risk giving that free will to them, because the humans might misuse their free will, and that's what happened. In doing so, the humans unleashed forces into this world which God never intended, forces of evil. It brings suffering into the storyline that is not productive of growth, but rather suffering that is a burden, that's destructive of the good. And this suffering is not the will of God. So you can see the resonance with that fourth model we looked at last time. As Nicholas Walterstorff said when his 25-year-old son Eric died from a mountain climbing accident, death is demonic. It is not a regular tool of God, but rather God opposes it. This divine opposition to suffering is seen in God's attitude to the suffering of the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt during the Exodus story. But it is seen most clearly in Jesus' predetermined opposition to the demonic and his constant efforts to heal people. It is seen in Jesus' own suffering on the cross, which was an injustice. So, what this second move in the narrative shows us is that while God is all-powerful, God is not the will and cause of all things. There are things that happen that God does not want, and God battles those things. Now, this explains the pandemic. Whether the virus escaped from a lab while it was being studied, or it jumped from bats to pangolins, which are Asian anteaters sold in the live market in Wuhan, to humans, bats, anteaters, humans. Human free choices were involved. Groups of people may simply have been careless and perhaps illegal. And that was not the will of God. That was the action of humans. The same is true of efforts by governments to hide the outbreak or to delay a response for personal or political motivations. Viruses may be part of the good creation, but that does not mean that God wants a pandemic to ravage society. So, we've seen that there are different kinds of suffering in the world that the all-good, all-powerful God made as all good. Some forms of suffering, as was said in Model 2, actually do lead to beauty and goodness and growth. They make the world and us better. But not all forms of suffering are like that. Some forms of suffering are, in fact, radical and destructive of the good and of our souls. And God didn't want or cause those. They emerge in this world because of the misuse of human freedom. All right. However, there's a third part to the narrative, Act 3. And that's the story of The story of redemption. And so this picks up that third piece of Dan Migliori's definition of God as love. God is self-giving, suffering, victorious love. And that's what makes this third model different from the fourth. Okay, so the third model adds this piece of the biblical narrative that's not present in model 4, the victory of God over evil and suffering. It gains this from the raising of Jesus from the dead. This also tells us something about how God relates to the pandemic. The loss and suffering and death, they're not the end of the story. Rather, life is. The raising to new life of those who've been taken by this pandemic. This third model looks at Jesus and also sees how God responds to evil. God improvises. Now, many things that happen in this world happen according to natural laws and chance. And many other things that happen according to human free will. Yet, at times, God does act to move our lives or history in certain directions. At key junctures, God acts to cause events which then wildly open up prospects for the good. Now, what this means is that we can indeed pray to God for protection from COVID or to heal us or to heal a beloved family member. God may, in fact, do that. But God might not, because God must also uphold another valuable trait of this good creation, its relative autonomy. If God acts too frequently to alter the courses of things, then the world ceases to be independent. So, this also means that God is working in and through doctors and scientists to come up with a vaccine. And at critical junctures in that search, God may act to push the discovery forward in significant ways. Now, this third model is unique in that it is specifically Christian. God is a governor with a secret plan, or God is a crafter of souls, or God is a warrior battling the virus. All these models can be understood from a Unitarian version of monotheism. And so all three of those options have their equivalents in the other world religions. But this third model is based on a Trinitarian and incarnational view of God, and so it's only found in this one Christian religion. Of the four models, it is the one that I found least frequently in the media in the last few months about the pandemic. It wasn't present that often. Now, it might not be present either when preached in sermons from the pulpit of Christian churches in the last few months, but that I don't know. So I didn't find it very often, but I did find it. James Martin is a Jesuit priest and the editor of America Magazine, which is published weekly by the Jesuits. Martin writes an article about the pandemic in which he begins with model number 2, suffering as pedagogy and soul-making. Martin recognizes that this is the most common answer to sufferings, but he feels that it is deaf to the gospel. Martin writes, while explaining suffering as a test may help in minor trials, like being patient when you're being annoyed by somebody, this fails the most painful human experiences. Does God send cancer to test a young child? Yes, the parents may learn something about perseverance or faith, but that approach can make God out to be a monster. Now, Martin also rejects the common view found in number 1, that suffering is a punishment for sin. To refute it, and here he shows he's following model 3, Martin goes to Jesus in the Gospels, where Jesus rejects the claim that a man who was born blind did so because somebody sinned, either he or his parents. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said. Martin says, This is Jesus' definitive rejection of the image of the monstrous God. Martin also notes that those who claim sufferings are a punishment for sins usually say that God punishes people or groups that they themselves disapprove of. So, moving beyond models 1 and 2, Martin then says that the honest answer to why the COVID-19 virus is killing hundreds of thousands of people is this: we don't know. He admits that viruses are part of the natural world and in some way contribute to life, but he does not know why infectious diseases ravage humanity, nor why it takes one particular loved one away. This is what differentiates this third model from the other three. In the first two models, God does not want to stop the disease. In the fourth, God is horrified by it, but cannot stop it unilaterally. But in this third model, God does not want the virus, and the mystery is why a God who is all-powerful and could stop it does not. And Martin asks, can you believe in this kind of a God? One who could stop it and does not. Martin then quickly asks the question, who is this God? What do we know about this God? For Christians, he says, the answer is found in Jesus, the fully human and fully divine one. Jesus lived in a world where an abscessed tooth could kill. He knows about disease. And in his ministry, Jesus was moved with pity at what he saw, and he acted to heal people from illnesses and disabilities. Jesus shows us the heart of God, and Jesus knows what it is like to be us. Here's a second place where I found this view, all the way in Ireland. Pastor Steve Stockman of Fitzroy Presbyterian Church in Belfast also begins with mystery when he thinks of the troubles of 9/11, of the 2004 tsunami, and of this pandemic. But he finds the compassionate God present not above it all, safe in heaven, but in the midst of all of this suffering. Stockman writes, so, in the deep, dark depths of coronavirus, I expect God to be where God always is, hovering over this murkiness, this tragedy, empathizing with those who have lost loved ones, and fighting for their lives in Nightingale hospitals. Stockman brings in the category of tragedy for this event. But Stockman does not leave it at that. He goes on to say, and I did not only expect God to just be there, but to be creating too. God will be weaving good in this seeming despair. The Reformed pastor Tim Keller of Redeemer Church in New York City and the physician-scientist Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, went straight to Jesus to interpret this event when they gave a joint interview. And what do these two Christians see? They see a God who is grieved, not planning or causing the pandemic. Keller goes on to say that God comes into this world voluntarily to experience it all. Why does God allow the pandemic to happen? Keller says he does not know. But he points to Jesus' response when Jesus' friend Lazarus died in John 11. Jesus prays, and he weeps, and then he helps. That is a model of who God is and what God does. And Keller says, Jesus gives us a promise. The world will not always be this way, where pandemics take away the ones we love. There will be a pandemic-free world, the new creation.